She was the most powerful woman in the room, and she was eating bread alone. Victoria Langford sat perfectly straight, wineglass untouched, eyes drifting to the entrance every 40 seconds. Mason counted. He was standing near the hostess stand when he recognized her, the sharp jaw, the silver-streaked hair she wore like a crown, and his stomach dropped. He hadn't seen her in 2 years, not since everything with Alyssa fell apart. Victoria was smiling at her phone with the practiced calm of someone who had spent decades making sure no one could read her face. But Mason had always been able to read faces. It was literally his job. And what her face said, underneath all that composure, was, "He's not coming." If you've ever watched someone realize they've been stood up in public, you know the particular kind of quiet devastation it carries, the way they fold it carefully and tuck it somewhere no one can see. Victoria Langford was doing exactly that. And Mason Reed, a man who had absolutely no business walking toward her table, was walking toward her table anyway. If this story moves you, leave a like and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The client meeting was supposed to start at 7. Mason checked his watch, 6:48, and scanned the restaurant for David Harlow, the architect who'd hired him 3 weeks ago to redesign the interior of a boutique hotel on Broadway. Harlow was one of those clients who sent 17 texts a day and then showed up late to everything. Mason wasn't worried. He had learned somewhere between his mid-20s and now that the most anxious clients were also usually the most forgiving ones. What he hadn't prepared for was this. He spotted Victoria before he spotted a single empty table, which was saying something because Peleus was the kind of Nashville restaurant that filled every seat by 6:30 on a Thursday. It occupied the second floor of a converted warehouse near the Gulch, all exposed brick and low pendant lighting and the kind of menu that used the word artisanal without embarrassment. Mason had been here twice before, both times with clients who were trying to impress someone. He understood its particular language, the way the candlelight made everyone look slightly better than they were, the way the ambient jazz smoothed over silences that might otherwise get uncomfortable. Victoria Langford was sitting at a table for two near the east window, and the chair across from her was very, very empty. He almost kept walking. That was his first instinct. Keep moving. Find the hostess. Ask about his reservation. Pretend he hadn't seen her. They hadn't ended badly exactly. Victoria and him. Their relationship, such as it was, had been conducted almost entirely on the periphery of his relationship with Alyssa. Dinners at the Langford house where Victoria would ask him about his work with the kind of genuine curiosity that Alyssa rarely showed. Phone calls where he'd somehow ended up discussing Nashville's architectural history for 40 minutes before remembering he'd called to check on a birthday party date. They had been something like friends. And then Alyssa had happened and ended, and he had assumed that Victoria went with the rest of it. He hadn't missed Alyssa. Not really, not after the first few months, but if he was being honest with himself, and he'd gotten better at that since becoming a father, he had missed Victoria. She was looking at her phone with the expression of someone reading something that didn't require any expression at all. Blank, deliberately blank. Her wineglass had been poured and left alone. The breadbasket in the center of the table had one piece missing, eaten with the careful precision of someone buying time. She was dressed the way she always dressed, beautifully, deliberately, like every choice had been made hours ago and she had simply executed it. Navy blazer, simple gold at her ears, hair swept back with a single pin she always wore slightly off-center, a quirk Mason had noticed the very first time they'd met and had never stopped noticing. She checked the entrance, looked back at her phone, checked the entrance again. Mason stood near the hostess stand for 31 seconds, which felt like considerably longer, and then he walked toward her table. He didn't have a plan. He never had a plan. It was one of the things Alyssa had criticized most about him, his habit of moving toward things on instinct and figuring out the rest while he was already in motion. You just do things, she'd said once, not entirely as a compliment. You just walk into situations like you belong there. He'd thought about that a lot afterward, whether it was a flaw or something else. He still wasn't sure. Victoria. She looked up. And for a half second before she locked everything back into place, he saw it. The flash of relief that crossed her face before she replaced it with something more controlled. Surprise. Warmth. a smile that was slightly too wide to be entirely natural. Mason, she set her phone face down on the table. I wasn't expecting to see you here. I've got a client meeting, he said. 7 o'clock. Ah, she nodded, glancing toward the bar. You look well. You too. He paused. The chair across from her was still empty. He looked at it, then at her, then back at it. Are you waiting for someone? Something moved behind her eyes. A calculation, or maybe just a decision. I was, she said. I think I'm done waiting. He pulled out the chair. Mind if I sit for a bit? My client's running late. Victoria looked at him for a moment that lasted longer than most moments did. He had always been slightly uncomfortable under her gaze, and not in a bad way, just in the way you feel when someone is actually seeing you rather than just looking at you. She had that quality. She'd always had it. Sit down, Mason, she said, and the smile that came after was smaller and more real than the one before it. He'd been 26 when he first met Victoria Langford. Alyssa had introduced them at a Sunday dinner that felt, in retrospect, more like an audition than a meal. The Langford house in Green Hills was large without being ostentatious, the kind of home that communicated money through restraint rather than display, which Mason, who spent his professional life thinking about exactly these things, had immediately respected. Hardwood floors, original to the house, crown molding that someone had cared about, a kitchen that had been updated twice but kept the bones of something older and more considered. Victoria had shaken his hand and said, Alyssa tells me you're in interior design. Not as a dismissal, as an opening. She'd asked what drew him to it. He told her about his grandmother's house in East Nashville, the way certain rooms had made him feel certain things before he understood why, the way he'd spent most of his childhood trying to figure out how a space could change the way you moved through it. Victoria had listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been, and then she'd said, That's essentially what I do with companies. Figure out why they move the way they do, and then try to change it. They'd talked for the better part of an hour while Alyssa texted at the kitchen counter, and the food got cold. That should have told him something. It hadn't. He'd been too caught up in being in love with a woman who was impressed by his ambition in theory and impatient with its demands in practice. Alyssa was beautiful and bright and funny, and she had wanted him in the early months with an intensity that felt like finally being chosen by something that mattered. He understood now that he'd confused her initial excitement for compatibility. By the time he figured out the difference, they'd been together almost 3 years. Victoria had been a constant throughout. Not intrusive, not the kind of mother who inserted herself where she wasn't wanted, but present. She'd come to the gallery opening where he'd done the interior design. She'd sent a text when a project of his had been featured in a local magazine. She'd called once, out of nowhere, to recommend a contractor she thought might be useful for a job he'd mentioned 6 weeks earlier at a family dinner. He'd realized, during the low and difficult months after Alyssa, that the relationship he'd most enjoyed during that time had not been the romantic one. He hadn't let himself follow that thought anywhere. He had other things to think about. More pressing things. He had Sophie. How old is she now? Victoria asked. He'd mentioned Sophie within the first 5 minutes, which was just how it was. He didn't apologize for it anymore. Almost 6, he said. She started kindergarten in September. She cried for the first 3 days, and then on the 4th day told me it was actually fine and that she had made a friend named Priya who knew how to do cartwheels. Victoria smiled. A real one, this time. She sounds like you. The crying part or the rallying part? Both. She picked up her wine glass finally and took a small sip. Are you managing all right? On your own? Most days. He turned his water glass on the table, a habit he'd had since childhood. I've got a good babysitter. My sister helps when she's in town. We've worked out a system. He paused. Sophie's mom is in Seattle. We've got an arrangement that works. Most of the time. He didn't want to say more than that. Not because it was painful. It wasn't, not anymore, but because Sophie's mother was a different conversation, one that required more context and more patience than a Thursday dinner at Pelias could really hold. You were always going to be a good father, Victoria said. I thought that even when you and Alyssa were together. You have the right kind of steadiness for it. He looked at her. The right kind of steadiness. Some people are steady the way furniture is steady. They just sit there. She set her glass down. You're steady the way a house is steady. There's structure to it, something underneath. She made a small, self-deprecating gesture. I'm sorry. I sound like a fortune cookie. No, he said. No. That was actually a really good thing to say. She laughed, and it was so unexpected and unguarded that the people at the next table glanced over. Mason hadn't heard her laugh like that before. Not like that. Surprised by herself. Slightly embarrassed by the volume of it. I have, she said, recovering, been told that I occasionally say things that are useful. Occasionally. Don't push it, Reed. He grinned. He'd always liked the way she used his last name. Alyssa had done it sometimes, as a tease, but when Victoria did it, it felt like the shorthand of people who'd known each other long enough to stop needing the formality. The waiter appeared. Mason ordered a sparkling water and glanced at the menu, then at his watch, then at the entrance. 6:58. Harlow was officially late. You can look at the menu, Victoria said. I'm not going to feel abandoned. I wasn't worried about that. You were looking at me the way people look at potted plants when they're trying to seem casual. She tilted her head. It's all right. Eat. He'll get here when he gets here. He ordered the pan-seared salmon. She ordered a second glass of wine and the risotto she'd apparently been trying to decide on for the past 20 minutes. They ate without the self-consciousness that typically attended meals between people who weren't quite sure what they were to each other. It surprised him how easy it was. It surprised him every time, and this time more than any before it. How's the company? He asked. Victoria's expression shifted, not dramatically, just a small rearrangement around the eyes. Growing, she said, which sounds like a good thing. But growth requires decisions, and decisions require time, and time is the thing I seem to perpetually run out of. She twisted her wine glass by the stem. We're in acquisition talks with a firm in Atlanta. It's been 6 months of negotiations, and I am very ready for it to be over. Will it? Probably by the end of the quarter. Maybe sooner, if their legal team stops asking questions they already know the answers to. She paused. It's fine. It's all fine. I'm just... She stopped. What? She was quiet for a moment, and he recognized the quality of the silence. It was the silence of someone deciding whether to say the real thing or the easier thing. I'm tired, she said. Not dramatically, just honestly. He didn't fill the space after it. He'd learned that some statements need room to exist before anyone tries to respond to them. I turned 50 last month, she continued, which is, it's a number. It doesn't feel different than 49 felt. But I had this dinner, this big dinner at the house, and there were 40 people there, and they all said the right things. And the flowers were beautiful, and the food was excellent. And I remember standing in my kitchen at 11 o'clock, cleaning up and thinking... She paused again. I'm not sure what I was thinking. What do you think you were thinking? She looked at him. The candlelight caught the gray at her temples. She'd always worn it openly, which Mason had always quietly admired, the lack of apology in it. And her expression was careful in the way of someone who had spent most of their life being careful about exactly this kind of thing. I think I was thinking that I should have been happier, she said. I think I was thinking that I did everything right, and I'm not sure that was the point. The waiter refilled his water. A jazz quartet in the corner shifted into something slower. At the table to his left, a couple was laughing about something on one of their phones. That easy, loose laughter of people who were comfortable with each other in the way that takes years to build. Can I tell you something? Mason said. You're going to anyway. When I was dating Alyssa, he said, the part I was most looking forward to, when we'd have dinner at your house, wasn't the dinner with Alyssa. He kept his voice even, not confessional, just honest. It was the part after, when you and I would end up in the living room while she answered emails and we'd talk about Nashville or design or whatever you'd been reading. Those were... He stopped, sorted through the words. I always left those evenings feeling like I'd actually been somewhere. Victoria was looking at him very steadily. Mason, she said. I'm not saying anything, he said. I'm just... You said you thought you should have been happier. I think the people who are happiest are the ones who notice what they actually enjoy and let themselves enjoy it instead of deciding whether they're supposed to. She was quiet for a long moment. "When did you get wise?" she asked, and it wasn't quite sarcastic and it wasn't quite not. "I had a kid," he said. "Turns out they simplify your thinking considerably." By 7:30, David Harlow had texted twice, first to say he was running 20 minutes behind, then to say it was going to be more like 40. He was so sorry. Terrible traffic. Could they reschedule for next week? Mason had written back, "No problem, let's do Tuesday." And then he'd put his phone down, and Victoria had raised an eyebrow, and he'd said, "Client canceled." And she'd said, "What a shame," in a tone that suggested she didn't think it was a shame at all. They stayed for another hour and a half. They talked about Sophie's obsession with marine biology, which she had developed after watching a documentary about octopuses and had since sustained through 17 library books and 2 trips to the aquarium. They talked about a project Mason was finishing in East Nashville, a bungalow renovation for a couple who disagreed about almost everything except that they wanted something that felt lived in from the first day. They talked about Victoria's years building Langford Consulting from a 2-person firm operating out of her dining room into the regional powerhouse it was now, not with the polished cadence of a keynote speaker, but in fragments, the way people talk about things that actually cost them something. The early years when she'd been simultaneously running a company and raising a teenager on a timeline that left no room for error. The partnerships that had worked and the ones that hadn't, and the specific kind of loneliness that comes from being in charge of something large enough that no one around you is ever quite telling you the whole truth. "Do you ever want to stop?" Mason asked. "Stop what?" "All of it. Consulting, acquisitions, being the one everyone's watching." She considered it for a moment. "Sometimes," she said. "And then I think about who I'd be if I stopped, and I realize I haven't figured that out yet. So I keep going." She paused. "What about you? Do you ever want to build someone else's vision forever, or do you have something of your own you're trying to get to?" He leaned back in his chair. No one asked him that. His clients asked what he could do for them. His sister asked if he was managing okay. His babysitter asked if Sophie had eaten dinner before she arrived. He could not remember the last time someone had asked him what he was building toward. "I want my own studio," he said. "Not just a practice. A studio. With a philosophy. A point of view." He kept his voice level, like he was saying something ordinary, though it wasn't ordinary, not really. It was the thing he thought about at 11 o'clock when Sophie was finally asleep and the apartment was quiet. "I want to design spaces that do something. Not just look good. Actually change how people feel when they're in them." "What's stopping you?" "Money, mostly. Time. The fact that I'm currently a single father running a small design practice out of a shared office in East Nashville." He picked up his fork, set it back down. "The list is not short." "Lists are just excuses wearing a spreadsheet," Victoria said. He looked at her. "Write down 2 things you'd need to start the studio," she said. "Not the whole list. 2 things. And then ask yourself which of those 2 things you can move on in the next 60 days. She shrugged slightly. "That's all I've ever done. Find the smallest door." He thought about it. "Capital and a partner," he said. "There you go," she said. "Now you have a direction." It was simple advice, the kind that sounded obvious when someone said it and somehow hadn't occurred to you before they did. But it wasn't just the advice. It was the steadiness of her voice when she gave it, the sense that she was seeing the possibility and not just the obstacles, and he felt something shift in his chest, quiet, like a door opening rather than a bang, that he recognized but did not quite allow himself to name. They were on coffee when Alyssa walked in. Mason saw her first. The restaurant's entrance was over Victoria's right shoulder, and he had a clear sight line, and Alyssa Langford, 29 now, hair shorter than he'd last seen it, wearing the particular expression of someone who was about to meet someone they were trying to impress, came through the door with her eyes already scanning the room. Her eyes found her mother. Then they found him. Mason watched the sequence of it happen in her face, confusion, then recognition, then something harder and hotter that he didn't have a name for but understood immediately as a problem. "Victoria," he said quietly. She caught his tone and turned. Alyssa was already walking toward them, and she was walking fast. "Mom!" She stopped at the edge of the table, not looking at Mason, or looking at him exactly the way you look at something you're pretending not to see. I didn't know you were coming here tonight. I had plans, Victoria said. Her voice was careful. Alyssa, what are you... I'm meeting someone. She finally looked at Mason, a direct, deliberate look that lasted about 2 seconds too long. Hi, Mason. Hey, Alyssa. The word hey had never done so much heavy lifting in the English language. You two are having dinner together, Alyssa said. It wasn't quite a question. Mason joined me when his client canceled, Victoria said. We ran into each other. What are you doing here? There was a gentleness in the question, a careful management, and Mason recognized it as the specific mode Victoria operated in when she was navigating her daughter, attentive, controlled, always slightly braced. I told you, meeting someone. She was still looking at Mason. You didn't mention you were still in touch with my mother. We weren't, he said. We ran into each other tonight. You've been here for... She glanced around, as if calculating from the state of their table, the empty dessert plates, the coffee cups. A while. My client canceled pretty early, he said. Alyssa looked at her mother. Something moved in her expression that Mason couldn't quite read from his angle. It was quick and complicated, and then it was gone. I'll let you finish your coffee, she said. She smiled, and it was a tight, assembled kind of smile, the kind that takes effort. Good to see you, Mason. Really? She walked toward a table on the far side of the restaurant without waiting for a response. Victoria turned back. She had her hands folded around her coffee cup, and her expression was measured in the way of someone who has just watched a small fire start and is trying to determine whether to address it or let it burn down on its own. She's fine, Mason said, though he wasn't certain of it. She's not fine, Victoria said quietly, but she will be. She picked up her coffee, set it down without drinking. I'm sorry about that. You don't have to be. I know. She looked out the window. The city was lit up past the glass, headlights and neon and the particular amber warmth of a southern city at night. I just am anyway. He drove home an hour later with Sophie's soccer cleat on the passenger seat floor and a half-eaten pack of crackers wedged between the console and the seat, and the memory of Victoria's laugh, that surprised, embarrassed, unguarded laugh, playing on a small loop in the back of his mind. He let himself think about it for a few miles, and then he let himself stop, because Sophie would be asleep already, and the babysitter had a morning class, and there were dishes in the sink, and a proposal due by Friday, and this, whatever this was not the most practical direction for his thoughts. He parked in front of his apartment building and sat in the car for a moment. I think I was thinking that I should have been happier. He picked up Sophie's soccer cleat from the floor and carried it inside. Bad. Sophie was indeed asleep, one arm thrown over her stuffed whale named Gerald, her hair escaping its braid in approximately 17 directions. Mason paid the babysitter, watched her go, locked the door, and stood in his kitchen eating the leftover pasta he'd made Tuesday night and staring at the list he'd written on a post-it sometime last week. Call electrician/school form/deposit for Henderson project/callback mom. He found a new post-it, wrote 2 words, capital, partner. He stuck it to the cabinet above the coffee maker, where he'd see it in the morning. Then he went to bed and didn't sleep for a while, but not for the reasons he might have expected, or maybe exactly for them. He wasn't sure yet. He was still working that out. The post-it was still on the cabinet 3 days later. Mason had looked at it every morning while the coffee brewed. Capital. Partner. And every morning he had thought about it for approximately 90 seconds before Sophie appeared in the kitchen, demanding either cereal or pancakes, never anything in between, and the day took over the way days do when you're the only adult in a household. But the post-it stayed. He'd made a rule for himself a few years back. If he wrote something down and didn't throw it away, he had to reckon with it eventually. It was a low-bar system, but it worked better than the alternative, which was keeping everything in his head where it could quietly dissolve into anxiety. He hadn't texted Victoria. He wasn't sure if he was supposed to. The evening at Peleus had the particular quality of something that felt significant while it was happening, and then immediately became difficult to categorize afterward. They weren't friends exactly, or they were, but of a kind that had no established protocol. The last time they'd seen each other, he had been Alyssa's boyfriend. Now he was just a man who had sat across from her for 2.5 hours and felt, for the first time in longer than he could precisely identify, completely present in a conversation. He thought about the way she'd said, "I think I was thinking that I should have been happier." He'd been turning it over for days, not obsessively, just the way you turn over something with an interesting weight to it. On Saturday, Victoria texted him, "I don't usually do this, but I wanted to say that Thursday was genuinely the best evening I've had in a long time. Thank you for sitting down." He read it standing in the parking lot of a hardware store with Sophie on his hip because she had refused to walk the last block and a half, and he had, as usual, given in. He read it twice, then typed, "Likewise. Sophie says hi. She doesn't know who you are, but she says hi to everyone." 3 dots appeared then. "That's the most honest form of goodwill. Give her my regards." He put his phone in his pocket. Sophie said, "Who was that?" "A friend," he said. "From work?" "Sort of." "Do they have kids?" "She has a daughter." Sophie considered this with the focused seriousness she applied to all new information. "Is the daughter nice?" Mason thought about Alyssa at the restaurant, the assembled smile, the way she'd said really at the end of "good to see you," Mason like a door quietly closing. "I think she's working on it," he said. He called Victoria the following Tuesday, which surprised him a little. He hadn't entirely decided to until he was already dialing. She picked up on the 3rd ring. "Reed." "Langford." He was sitting in his car outside the shared office, the engine off, a takeout coffee going lukewarm in the cup holder. "I wanted to ask you something." "All right." "The 2 things, capital and a partner." He hadn't told anyone else about the Post-it, not his sister, not his business partner Dana, who handled his accounting and would have had opinions. "I've been thinking about the partner piece, not someone to do the work. I can do the work. Someone who understands business structure, scaling, how to build something that doesn't collapse the first time a big client walks out." There was a brief pause. "You're not asking me to be your business partner?" "No," he said. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to have coffee and talk about what that person would look like. Because I think you've built exactly the kind of thing I'm trying to build, and I think you'd tell me the truth about where I'm wrong." Another pause, he couldn't tell what kind. "Wednesday," she said. "I have a gap at 2. 2 works. There's a place on 8th, Biscuit Love, but go around the corner to the cafe next door, less crowded." "I know it." "Don't bring a business plan," she said. "If you walk in with a folder, I'm leaving." He laughed. "No folder." "Good." He could hear something in the background, shots, voices, the particular echo of a large office. "Mason." "Yeah." "I'm glad you called." She said it the same way she said most things, directly, without decoration, as though she'd already decided whether it was true before she said it. "Me too," he said, and meant it. The cafe on 8th was the kind of place that could have been annoying. Reclaimed wood, hand-lettered menus, a playlist curated to within an inch of its life. But somehow wasn't, maybe because the coffee was genuinely excellent and the chairs were comfortable enough that you could stay for 2 hours without regretting it. Victoria was already there when he arrived, 3 minutes early, seated at a corner table with her laptop closed and a cortado in front of her. She was wearing a gray blazer over a white shirt, the same off-center pin at her collar, and she looked like someone who had come from a meeting and was heading to another one but had blocked out this particular hour as non-negotiable. "You look surprised I'm here," she said. "I'm not surprised, I'm just—" He sat down. "You're always on time." "I'm always early. There's a difference." She pushed a small menu toward him. "The oat latte is good if you're into that." "I'm not, but people seem to like it." He ordered a regular coffee, which appeared to satisfy some private standard of hers, and then they talked for just over 2 hours, and it was nothing like a business meeting and everything like one. Victoria asked questions Mason hadn't thought to ask himself, not about his aesthetic vision, which she seemed to take as a given, but about his client base and how he'd built it, about what he charged and whether it reflected what he was actually worth, about the projects he'd turned down and why, about what he most wanted to stop doing. She wasn't soft about it. When he said he sometimes took projects he didn't believe in because the money was useful, she said, That's how you end up with a portfolio that looks scattered and a reputation that's hard to define, without any particular cruelty, but without softening it either. He didn't mind. He'd always appreciated being talked to like someone who could handle the truth. You need someone who's built a service firm, she said eventually, not a product company. The dynamics are different. You're selling trust and vision, not a thing. The person who should be your business partner has to understand that the client relationship is the product. She turned her cortado glass in a small circle on the table. There's a woman named Ellen Park. She runs a brand consultancy out of Midtown. Small, intentional, she's done it for about 8 years. We've worked adjacent to each other on a couple of projects. I think you'd find her thinking useful. Would you make an introduction? I'll think about it, she said, which meant yes, he'd come to understand, delivered after a reasonable interval during which she'd have actually thought about whether it was the right call. He walked her to her car, which was parked half a block away. The afternoon had turned cool in the way Nashville afternoons did in late October, abrupt, like someone had changed the channel, and she'd pulled her blazer tighter without seeming to notice she'd done it. On the sidewalk outside the garage, she stopped and turned to him, and there was something slightly different in her expression, not the boardroom directness, something a layer under it. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure. Thursday, at the restaurant. She met his eyes and held them. The person I was waiting for. I had met him through one of those applications. We had exchanged messages for 3 weeks, and he seemed... She stopped. Chose a different word. Reasonable. We had agreed to meet at 7. He texted at 6:52 to cancel. No real explanation. Mason said nothing, just waited. I sat there for a few minutes deciding whether to leave, she said. And then you walked in and I felt... She paused again, and it was the kind of pause that meant she was being careful with what she chose to put into language. Relieved isn't the right word. It was more specific than that, like something that had been locked, clicked open. She looked at him steadily. I'm telling you this because I think you should know, not because I expect you to do anything with it. The garage entrance was behind her. Somewhere up the block, a delivery truck was idling, and a woman was yelling into her phone about a permit. The city was doing what it always did, indifferent to the specific gravity of this particular moment on this particular sidewalk. Victoria, he said. Don't say anything careful, she said, and almost smiled. I can tell when you're about to say something careful. He wasn't sure what the alternative was. He was aware of standing closer to her than he might have otherwise, and of the way the light was hitting the gray in her hair, and of the fact that she had just handed him something real, something she'd turned over privately for days probably, and he did not want to fumble it. I know what you mean, he said, about something clicking open. She looked at him for a moment. Just a moment. Good, she said. And she said goodbye and walked into the garage, and he stood on the sidewalk for a few seconds afterward and watched the space where she'd been. And then he walked back to his own car and drove to pick up Sophie and made dinner and helped with homework, and did not, this time, stop himself from following the thought wherever it wanted to go. They started meeting regularly in the way of people who have found a frequency that suits them and see no reason to fight it. Coffee on Wednesdays became dinner every other Thursday. A different restaurant each time, the kind of deliberate variation that suggested someone was paying attention to where they'd already been. Mason started recognizing Victoria's preferences. She ordered fish when it was simply prepared and avoided it when it wasn't. She hated background music loud enough to require leaning in. She always read the menu front to back before deciding anything, and then usually ordered the things she'd noticed second. He told her things he didn't normally tell people. Not dramatic things. He didn't have many dramatic things, but the close and ordinary ones. He told her about the year after Sophie was born, when he'd been with Sophie's mother in a relationship that was technically functioning but had the feeling of a building where the load-bearing walls had been quietly removed. He told her about the drive to the hospital, Sophie's mother in the passenger seat, snow on the 440, his hands on the wheel. Thinking, this is it. This is the thing. Everything before this was just getting here. He told her Sophie had been born at 4:17 in the morning and that she had come out crying like she was furious about something, which had remained consistent. Victoria listened to all of it with her elbows on the table and her wine glass forgotten at her elbow, and she didn't offer the kinds of responses people typically offered, the reassuring nods, that must have been so hard. She just listened and occasionally asked something that suggested she'd been tracking everything he'd said very closely. She told him in return things that she introduced with phrases like, "I don't generally say this out loud," and then said out loud. She told him she had built the company partly as a response to a marriage that had ended when Alyssa was 7, a marriage to a man who had been charming and intermittently present, and who had fundamentally not understood that her ambition was not a problem to be managed, but a thing she simply was. She told him that the divorce had been the right call, and that she had still spent a year after it feeling like she'd failed at something foundational. She told him that she had dated exactly 4 men since, 2 of whom she'd liked, none of whom she'd let close enough to see the way she left her shoes slightly off-center by the door, and her reading glasses on the bathroom counter, and her laptop open on the kitchen table at 11 o'clock because she was still thinking about the Atlanta acquisition, even when she was ostensibly watching television. "You're describing someone who doesn't really let people in," Mason said. "I'm describing someone who got very good at providing the version of herself that required the least explanation," she said. "That's the same thing." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "It is." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, just for a second, the way you do when you want someone to know you've heard them without making it a production. She looked down at his hand and then up at him, and she didn't move hers away, and neither of them said anything, and then the waiter appeared and the moment folded itself back into the ordinary texture of the evening, but something had been established that hadn't been there before. He introduced her to Sophie on a Saturday, which was either too soon or exactly right. He had stopped being able to calculate these things cleanly. It wasn't formal. Victoria had mentioned she was driving through his neighborhood to visit a client and might pass by, and Mason had said, "Come in for 20 minutes if you want," and she had, and Sophie had answered the door still in her soccer uniform with a grass stain on her knee and her hair in a state of advanced chaos, and had looked at Victoria for a very thorough moment and then said, "Are you Mason's friend from work?" "Sort of," Victoria said. "That's what he said." Sophie turned and walked back into the apartment, which was apparently invitation enough. Victoria looked at Mason. He shrugged. "She's efficient," he said. They sat in the kitchen while Sophie showed Victoria her marine biology notebook, which was technically a composition book into which she had taped printouts from the library and drawn her own diagrams in colored pencil with the intense dedication of someone filing a patent. Victoria looked at every page. She asked whether the diagram on page 12 was a cuttlefish or a squid, and Sophie said it was a cuttlefish and explained the difference with the authority of a professor. And Victoria said, "I didn't know that. I do now." And Sophie looked at her with the frank assessment children reserve for adults who haven't embarrassed themselves. "You can come back," Sophie announced. "I appreciate the invitation," Victoria said. "I'm going to finish my show," Sophie said, and disappeared into the living room. Mason looked at Victoria across the kitchen table. She was looking at the composition book Sophie had left behind, and her expression was something he hadn't seen on her before. Open, slightly undone, like she'd been caught off guard by something she wasn't prepared to feel. "She's remarkable," Victoria said. "I know." He said it the way he said everything about Sophie. Simple, factual, with the particular steadiness of someone who has built their whole life around one truth. "She makes it easy." Victoria looked up. "No," she said. "You make it look easy. That's different." She ran one finger along the edge of the composition book. "Alyssa was like that as a child, this specific, this sure of herself." She stopped. The mention of Alyssa entered the room quietly and settled there without either of them touching it for a moment. "I don't know when she stopped being sure." Mason picked up his coffee. "When did you notice?" "I'm not sure I did. Not soon enough." She closed the composition book. "That's the hardest thing about being a parent, I think. You don't get to see the important things while they're happening. You only recognize them later." He thought about Sophie in her soccer uniform, the grass stain, the marine biology notebook. He thought about all the ways she'd become herself while he was busy just trying to keep up with her. "Yeah," he said. "That's about right." It was Dana who said something first. Dana Reeves had handled Mason's accounting for 4 years and had thereby developed an understanding of his life that was at once purely financial and oddly intimate. She knew what he spent on groceries and what he'd paid for Sophie's school supplies, and what kind of months required him to push back on invoices. She knew, in other words, the actual texture of his life rather than the edited version. She came by the office on a Thursday afternoon to go over Q3 numbers, and afterward, when they were standing in the parking lot and Mason was unlocking his car, she said, "You seem different." "Different how?" "Less in your head." She tilted her head, studying him with the same directness she applied to balance sheets. "Are you seeing someone?" He didn't answer immediately, which was its own kind of answer. "Mason, it's complicated," he said. "Complicated like she's not interested, or complicated like something else is making it complicated?" He thought about Alyssa at Peleus, the tight smile, the real and the assembled existing in her face simultaneously. "Something else," he said. Dana nodded in the manner of someone filing information for future reference. "Is she good to you?" "Yeah." He said it without having to think about it. "She is." "Then uncomplicate it," Dana said, and got in her car. He drove to pick up Sophie and thought about that. Uncomplicate it. And the simplicity of it was both appealing and slightly absurd, because it left out the part where Victoria had a daughter who had once been his girlfriend and who had looked at him across a restaurant with an expression that was still working its way through him, something between anger and something older and more private that he hadn't been able to name. He hadn't seen Alyssa since Peleus. He had thought about calling her and then thought better of it, and then thought about it again. There was no established protocol for this either. You couldn't reach out to your ex-girlfriend's mother's adult daughter to say, "I think I might be falling in love with your mother, and I wanted to talk about it before you found out another way." The sentence didn't exist, the occasion didn't exist, and even if it did, he wasn't sure he was ready to say it out loud. He wasn't sure he was ready for any of it, actually, but he thought about Victoria's hand under his at the dinner table, and how she hadn't moved it. He thought about Sophie saying you can come back with the severity of a small judge, issuing a binding ruling. He thought about the post-it on the cabinet, still there, coffee-stained now at one corner, and the way Victoria had said, "Find the smallest door," like it was simple, like it was always simple if you were willing to look directly at the thing you wanted, instead of building a careful architecture around it. He pulled into the school parking lot. Sophie came running across the blacktop toward his car with her backpack bouncing and her jacket halfway off one shoulder, and she pulled open the passenger door and climbed in and said, "Can we get dumplings?" "We have leftovers. The dumplings are better." "You're not wrong," he said. They got dumplings. And for the whole drive home, Sophie talked about a disagreement she'd had with her friend Priya about whether sharks or dolphins were more interesting. Sharks, Sophie's position, was the obviously correct answer. And Mason listened and agreed in the right places. And the evening was exactly what it always was. Imperfect and full, and completely his. But underneath it, quiet and persistent as something taking root, was the thought he kept returning to without meaning to. Find the smallest door. He thought he might have already found it. The Atlanta acquisition closed on a Wednesday, and Victoria texted him at 9:17 that night with, "Done." Finally done. He wrote back, "Celebrate tomorrow?" A pause of maybe 4 minutes, which for Victoria was the equivalent of careful deliberation. "Yes. Somewhere quiet. I'm tired of rooms full of people who want something from me." He took her to a place in Germantown he'd been saving for no particular reason. A small Italian restaurant that seated maybe 30 people, run by a couple who'd moved from Philadelphia 6 years ago and didn't take reservations and didn't have a website and was consequently always slightly hard to get into, but worth the effort. He'd done some consultation work on the interior 2 years back, minor stuff, helping them figure out why the lighting in the back half of the room felt off. The owner, a broad-shouldered man named Carlo, who greeted everyone like they'd just arrived at his actual house, saw Mason come in and waved them to a table in the corner without ceremony. "You know him?" Victoria said, settling into her chair. "I fixed his lighting." "Of course you did." She ordered a glass of Barolo and looked around the room with the particular expression she had when she was quietly approving of something. He'd learned to recognize it. A slight easing around the eyes, the shoulders dropping a fraction. "This is good," she said. "How did you find it?" "Client referral. 3 years ago. I drove by it 17 times before I actually came in." "Why?" He picked up his menu. "It looked too good to be as good as it looked, if that makes sense." Profound fear of disappointment disguised as prudence, she said. Something like that. She smiled and turned her attention to the menu, and Mason watched her for just a moment. The small vertical line that appeared between her brows when she was reading something carefully. The way she held the menu slightly farther from her face than she would have liked to. Too proud to say she needed glasses for distances she didn't technically need glasses for yet. These small things had accumulated in him over the past weeks like sediment, quietly and without his permission, until he found himself with a detailed and involuntary map of a person he had not 3 months ago expected to know this well. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You always preface questions that way," she said, eyes still on the menu. "As if you need permission." "I do need permission. For this one." She put the menu down, looked at him. "Are you happy?" he said. "Right now. Not in the abstract, not as a general life assessment. I mean tonight, sitting here." She was quiet for a moment, not the calculating kind of quiet, a softer one. "Yes," she said. "I am." She picked her menu back up. "Don't make it complicated." "I'm not," he said. "I just wanted to know." Well, the shift happened gradually and then all at once, the way most real things did. It was a Saturday evening in November when Mason cooked dinner for the first time at his apartment with Victoria present. Not a planned occasion, just the consequence of her stopping by to drop off a book she'd mentioned the week before. A collection of essays on American architecture she'd found at a used bookstore, and Sophie refusing to let her leave before she'd eaten something, because apparently that was a rule Sophie had decided existed. Victoria had laughed and stayed, perching on the kitchen counter, while Mason made pasta carbonara, and Sophie narrated a complicated story about something that had happened during recess that involved a disputed handball ruling and at least 3 people crying. He was draining the pasta when he became aware of the specific quality of the noise in his kitchen. Sophie's voice in its upper register, all urgency and grievance. Victoria's responses, short, interested, occasionally amused, threading through. The hiss of steam, the clink of plates, the particular layered sound of his home with people in it who were comfortable there, and he stood with the colander over the sink and felt something so uncomplicated and complete that it almost frightened him. He didn't say anything. He plated the pasta and they sat at the kitchen table, and Sophie made Victoria try hot sauce on her carbonara, which Victoria did with the expression of someone taking a calculated risk, and then pronounced it unnecessary but not actively unpleasant, and Sophie considered this a fair verdict. After dinner, Sophie fell asleep on the couch during a documentary about deep-sea creatures, one arm over Gerald the stuffed whale, and Mason carried her to bed while Victoria cleared the table. When he came back to the kitchen, she was washing the last of the dishes, which he hadn't asked her to do, and which somehow didn't feel presumptuous. It felt like something a person did when they were comfortable enough in a place to stop being a guest. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her, and then he crossed the kitchen and stood beside her at the sink and dried the bowl she handed him without a word. And the silence between them was the kind that had nothing uncomfortable in it, just 2 people in a kitchen at the end of an evening, and he thought about everything he'd been not quite saying for weeks, and decided that was probably enough time to not quite say it. "Victoria. I don't want to do the thing where we keep having dinners and coffees and acting like this is just 2 people who ran into each other at a restaurant and happened to enjoy each other's company." She turned off the water, dried her hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle. She didn't turn around immediately. "What do you want to do instead?" she said. "I think you know." She turned then, and her expression was one of the more complicated ones he'd seen on her. Not afraid exactly, but something adjacent to it. The look of a person standing at the edge of something real and accounting for what it would cost to step forward. "Mason," she said, "I'm 50 years old." "I know." "You're 32. "I know that too." "Alyssa, I know," he said. "I've thought about all of it. I'm not asking you to pretend any of it isn't true." He held her gaze. "I'm asking you what you actually want. Not what makes sense, not what's easy, not what anyone else would say about it. What you want." The refrigerator hummed. Down the hall, Sophie made a small sound in her sleep, the way she always did around 11, some private conversation with a dream. The dish towel in Victoria's hands was twisted around her fingers. "I want this," she said quietly. I have wanted this for longer than I'm going to admit out loud tonight. He stepped forward and kissed her, and it was not a complicated kiss. It was a simple, direct, decided thing, the kind that doesn't have any ambivalence in it. She kissed him back, which also had no ambivalence in it, and when they separated, she let out a breath that sounded like something she'd been holding since September. "This is going to be difficult," she said. "Probably. Alyssa is going to—" "One thing at a time," he said. "Tonight is just tonight." She looked at him for a moment and then nodded, and the worry around her eyes didn't disappear entirely, but it settled into something she was willing to carry. He made tea. She stayed another hour. When she left, she paused at the door and looked at him the way she looked at things she hadn't decided whether to say. "Reed," she said. "Langford. Good night." And the small, real smile, not the assembled one, the other one, before she went. They were careful. Not secretive, but careful, because they were both people who had learned the difference. Victoria did not announce anything. Neither did Mason. What they had instead was the accumulating reality of time spent together. Dinners, walks through the park near Mason's building where Sophie insisted on stopping at every bench to examine it for interesting features. An afternoon at a furniture showroom where Mason was evaluating pieces for a client, and Victoria had strong opinions about joinery that turned out to be more informed than he'd expected. They were building something in the understated way of people who trust the material. Mason introduced her to his sister Claire, who was in from Memphis for a long weekend, in a way that was deliberate without making a production of the deliberateness. Claire was 40, a physical therapist, relentlessly direct in the way of the Reed family, and she had looked at Victoria across the dinner table with the measuring quality of someone who would have her verdict before dessert. Afterward, doing dishes while Victoria was in the living room with Sophie looking at the marine biology notebook, Claire had said, "She's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Intimidating. She is intimidating." "Not like that." Claire handed him a plate. She actually listens, like she's tracking what you say and storing it." She paused. "Does she know how you look at her?" "What do you mean, how I look at her?" "Mason." He took the plate. "Yes," he said. "She knows." Claire nodded, in the manner of someone who has confirmed what they already knew. "She's good to Sophie?" Sophie showed her 11 pages of marine biology notes. "That's Sophie's highest compliment." "I know." Claire went back to washing. "Just be careful," she said, not unkindly. "Not of her. Of the situation. There are other people in this." "I know that too," he said. He knew. He thought about Alyssa more than he allowed himself to show, not with guilt exactly. The relationship had ended 18 months before he'd sat down at Victoria's table at Peleus, and it had ended because they'd run out of the specific energy that had sustained it, which was something Alyssa had known before he had, and she'd ended it, and that had been the right call, but with a kind of anticipatory weight. He knew Alyssa well enough to know she felt things deeply and processed them slowly and externalized almost nothing until it was too much, and then externalized everything at once. He had seen the look on her face at Peleus, and he had been waiting, in the background of everything good that was happening, for the other shoe. It fell on a Tuesday. Mkwasa. His phone rang at 8:15 in the morning while he was getting Sophie ready for school. He almost didn't answer. Sophie was mid-argument about whether her purple sneakers or her white ones were better for PE, a debate she conducted every Tuesday as if it were new information each time. But he saw Alyssa's name and stepped into the hallway. "Hey," he said. "We need to talk." Her voice was controlled in the way of someone who had been rehearsing, and underneath the control there was something strung tight. "Okay." "My mother," she said, and stopped. He heard her breathing on the other end. "Are you and my mother seeing each other?" Sophie appeared in the doorway, holding both pairs of sneakers. He held up one finger. She retreated. "Yes," he said. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that he checked his phone screen to make sure the call was still connected. "I see." 2 words, calibrated to reveal nothing. It was a thing Victoria did too, and he noticed it now. "Alyssa, how long?" "A few weeks. Officially." He kept his voice even. "We've been spending time together since October. We were honest about it when it..." "When it what?" Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. When it what, Mason? When did you decide this was something you were going to do? It wasn't a decision like that. It happened the way most things happen, gradually. And then, does she know you're telling me? She knows I was going to. Another silence. Then, I need you to understand something. The control in her voice had shifted. Not broken, but the quality of it was different, less rehearsed, more actual. I have spent my entire life watching people look at her. My mother walks into a room and it changes. I know that. I've always known that. And I told myself it didn't matter, that I was my own person, that it was fine. Her voice was thinner now. I dated you for 3 years. I know. You're standing in the place where she already was. In my life. Do you understand what that feels like? He stood in the hallway and did not try to argue with it, because it was not wrong, exactly. Not factually wrong, at least. And he knew that factually wrong was beside the point when someone was telling you how they felt. He had his own version of the story, and she had hers, and neither version was dishonest. I hear you, he said. Don't, she said sharply. Don't give me the therapy language. Alyssa, he leaned against the wall. I didn't do this to hurt you. I didn't do anything to hurt you. What happened between us happened because we weren't right for each other, and that was true before any of this. I know that. Her voice was quiet now, almost small. That's not... She stopped, started again. That's not entirely what this is. He waited. She didn't say anything else. He could hear her breathing, uneven, like someone trying to keep something contained. Can we meet? He said. Not a phone call, actually talk. I can't right now. And then, abruptly, I'll call you. She hung up. He stood in the hallway for a moment, holding his phone, and Sophie appeared again in the doorway with both sneakers still in her hands, looking at him with the focused attention she brought to situations where she sensed something was off. Purple, he said. She looked down at the sneakers. Yeah, she said. I think so too. He told Victoria that evening. They were at her house for the first time. A deliberate decision she'd made, suggesting it the week before with the understated significance of someone who doesn't let people into their space without meaning to. The house in Green Hills was exactly as he remembered, careful and warm, the bones of something older given room to breathe. She'd made dinner herself, which she was better at than she let on, and they'd eaten at the kitchen table with the kind of ease that still surprised him, how quickly ease had become the default register between them. He waited until they were on the back porch with coffee, the November air sharp and still, the city a warm glow beyond the trees. Alyssa called me this morning, he said. Victoria set her cup down. She'd known it was coming. She'd have known the moment it stopped being something she could postpone. How was she? Controlled, and then not. He looked out at the yard. She didn't say anything that wasn't legitimate, from her perspective. What did she say? He recounted it as accurately as he could, without editorializing, because Victoria deserved the real version. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her hands wrapped around her cup, looking at something in the middle distance. She's right about some of it, Victoria said. I know. Not about you and me, but about... She stopped. When she spoke again, her voice was different, lower, with the quality of something being handled carefully. I was never good at turning it off. Whatever it is that makes people look. I never figured out how to be less. I don't know how to say this without it sounding vain. Less present. I've watched Alyssa since she was a teenager. This particular thing she does when I walk into a room she's already in. This, bracing, like she's preparing for something. Mason was very still. I told myself it was normal mother-daughter friction, Victoria continued, that she'd grow out of it, that what looked like resentment was something else, something I was reading wrong. She set her cup down. I don't think I was reading it wrong. He reached across and put his hand over hers, the same way he had weeks ago at the restaurant table. She turned her hand over and held his. She needs to talk to you, he said. Not through me, just you. I know. The word was heavy with the particular weight of something a person has known for a while and has been circling rather than approaching. I've always been better with other people's problems than my own. She glanced at him sideways with a wryness that was covering something real. Occupational hazard. Or a good reason to talk to your daughter. She squeezed his hand once, then let go. Picked up her coffee. The porch was quiet except for the wind in the trees along the back fence. Are you going to run? She asked. Not aggressively, honestly, the way she asked most things. Because it's going to be messy for a while. Family things are always messier than they look from the outside. He thought about Sophie's composition book, about the post-it on his cabinet, about his kitchen with people in it and the specific quality of that noise. No, he said. She nodded, looked out at the yard. I need to call her, Victoria said. Yeah, he said. You do. She didn't do it that night, but she held her phone for a while on the drive home, which he could picture clearly though he hadn't seen it, and he knew she would. He knew her well enough now to know that when she decided something, she didn't spend long in the deciding. That was one of the things he was going to use the word, at least to himself, quietly, in the dark of his car driving home, loved about her. One of the things he had been building toward without knowing he was building, the way you don't always see the shape of a room until all the walls are up. He parked in front of his building and sat for a moment. Inside, Sophie was asleep with Gerald and the marine biology notebook. And tomorrow he had a site visit in the morning and a proposal to finish by Thursday. And the situation with Alyssa was real and unresolved and was going to require more than one difficult conversation to move through. None of that was nothing. All of it was going to cost something. He sat with that. Let it be what it actually was instead of making it smaller or larger than it was. Then he went upstairs, checked on Sophie, and went to bed. Victoria called Alyssa on a Thursday morning, standing in her kitchen with her second cup of coffee untouched on the counter. Alyssa picked up on the fifth ring, which meant she'd seen the name and held the phone and had to decide. Victoria knew this because she knew her daughter the way you know the architecture of a house you've lived in long enough. Not perfectly, not every corner, but the load-bearing walls, the places where the floor gives slightly underfoot. Hi, Alyssa said. Hi. Victoria looked out the kitchen window. The yard was bare now, November having finished what October started. I'd like to see you, not a phone call. Can you come to the house this weekend? A pause. Saturday? Saturday's fine. Lunch if you want, or just coffee, whatever you're comfortable with. Another pause, shorter. Okay, Alyssa said. Noon. Victoria said, I'll see you then. And they both hung up, and the call had lasted 43 seconds and contained almost nothing and required everything she had. She did not tell Mason about the call until after, which was a decision she made consciously and privately. This was between her and her daughter. Mason had been careful about exactly that line, careful not to position himself as the fulcrum of anything, not to make his presence in her life into a problem that required her to choose. And she had noticed this and was grateful for it in the specific way you're grateful for something that matters. He could have pushed. He hadn't. He'd said you need to talk to your daughter, and then stepped back and let her do it on her own terms and on her own timeline. And that was the kind of steadiness she'd been talking about the first night, the structural kind, and she felt it most clearly in the moments when he exercised it without mentioning it. Alyssa arrived at noon on Saturday with a bottle of wine she'd brought as either a peace offering or armor. Victoria wasn't sure which. She looked tired in a way that good grooming was mostly covering. She was wearing the dark green coat she'd had since graduate school, the one Victoria had offered twice to replace and that Alyssa had refused both times, and her hair was down, and she looked very young standing in the kitchen doorway while Victoria poured water and put out the bread and cheese she'd prepared because she needed something to do with her hands. Sit down, Victoria said. Alyssa sat. She put the wine bottle on the table and looked at it, then at the bread. You made an effort, she said, and there was no heat in it, just observation. I always make an effort when it's important. Victoria sat across from her. She had decided at some point in the preceding week that she was going to resist every instinct she had to manage this. Managing was what she did, with clients, with employees, with every situation that had sharp edges. She managed, she smoothed, she found the most efficient path from tension to resolution. She was not going to do that with her daughter. She was going to sit across the table and be a person instead of a function. It was harder than it sounded. I know about you and Mason, Alyssa said. He told me. You know he told me. I know. I wanted to talk about it with you directly. What is there to talk about? Not aggressive, genuinely asking. Whatever you need to say. Alyssa looked at her for a moment. That's very therapist of you. I mean it. I'm not here to explain myself. I'm here because you're my daughter, and something is happening between us that I've been too careful about to actually address. Something shifted in Alyssa's expression. Not the locked door opening, more like a light changing behind it. She broke off a small piece of bread and didn't eat it, just held it. What do you want me to say? She said. That I'm fine with it. I'm working on it. She set the bread down. It's strange, Mom. It's a strange thing to absorb. I know it is. Do you? It came out sharper than she'd intended by the look on her face after. He was... She stopped, restarted. He was mine. He was in my life. And I know we didn't work out. I know that. I ended it. I'm not confused about why we didn't work. She looked at the table. But there's a difference between knowing something and then watching your mother become the thing you couldn't be for someone. Victoria was very still. I'm not saying you did anything wrong, Alyssa continued. I know how this sounds. I know I'm sitting here resenting something that isn't even irrational. She stopped again, put her hands flat on the table. I'm tired of feeling like I can't compete with you, and I know I'm supposed to be past that. I'm almost 30. I know it's ridiculous. It's not ridiculous, Victoria said. It feels ridiculous. That doesn't make it not real. Alyssa looked up. Her eyes were bright and dry, the way of someone who has decided not to cry and is enforcing it through sheer structural will, which was, Victoria recognized with something close to pain, entirely her own trait come back to her in her daughter's face. You were always the most... Alyssa stopped. People look at you. People have always looked at you. When I was a teenager, I'd walk into rooms with you and I'd watch it happen. Men, women, everyone. Not just physical. You're just... She shook her head. You have whatever the thing is. The thing that makes people want to be near you. And I spent a very long time wondering when I was going to get it. Victoria said nothing. She was sitting with what it cost to hear this, what it cost to not reach across and cover it over with reassurance, to let it be what it was for a moment. I don't know when I decided that if I couldn't have it, I'd at least keep the people who saw it in me, Alyssa said, more quietly. But I think that might be what I did with Mason. I think I liked the way he looked at me. She paused. And then I watched how he looked at you. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed on the street. Alyssa, Victoria said, her voice was not managed. It was what it was. I owe you an apology. Alyssa blinked. For Mason, not for Mason. Victoria leaned forward slightly. For not seeing this sooner. For being so... She searched for the right word and chose honesty instead of the careful one. I've been so focused on not being the kind of mother who intrudes, who inserts herself, who makes her children feel watched and managed. I swung so far the other way that I wasn't paying attention. I was giving you space when you needed me to come closer. She paused. That's on me, not on you. Alyssa was looking at her with an expression Victoria had not seen on her daughter since she was very small. Not guarded, not assembled, just open. Young and open and slightly terrified by the exposure of it. I didn't know how to tell you, Alyssa said. I didn't know how to ask. A long silence. I still don't know how to feel about you and him, Alyssa said eventually. I know. I'm not asking you to be there yet. Victoria looked at her daughter directly. I'm asking you to keep talking to me. That's all. I don't need you to be fine with it today. I need you to stay in the room. Alyssa looked at the bread, picked up the piece she'd broken off earlier and ate it. It was such an ordinary gesture, so mundane, that Victoria felt something release in her chest. He has a kid, Alyssa said, not accusatory, just noting. Sophie? She's 5. She has very strong opinions about marine biology. Something crossed Alyssa's face. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one trying to exist. That sounds like something he'd produce. She's remarkable, Victoria said. She also told me I could come back the first time I met her, very formally. This time the shape became an actual thing, brief and reluctant and real. He was always good with kids, Alyssa said. I remember thinking that, like, this is the thing he'd actually be good at. She paused. He's going to be a good father. He already is, Victoria said. Alyssa nodded, picked up her water glass. I need some time, she said, to, I don't know, rearrange how I'm thinking about all of it. Take it. I'm not saying I'm blocking it. I'm just not. Alyssa. Victoria reached across the table and put her hand on her daughter's. Take whatever time you need. I'm not going anywhere. Alyssa looked at their hands. Her jaw moved. I miss talking to you, she said, and the words were small and cost something. I missed it too, Victoria said. More than I said. They ate bread and cheese and talked for another hour and a half about things that were not the difficult thing. Alyssa's work, a trip she was considering, a friend who had recently moved to Denver. The conversation had the slightly fragile quality of something still finding its footing, but it moved, and that was enough for a Saturday afternoon in November. Amas. Mason noticed the shift in Victoria the next time he saw her, which was Monday evening, and he noticed it in the specific way he noticed changes in rooms, not by cataloging individual elements, but by sensing how the whole thing sat differently. How was Saturday? He said. She was at his kitchen counter making tea, which she'd started doing with the ease of someone who knew where things were kept, which she did by now. She poured hot water into both cups before she answered. Hard, she said, and better than it's been in a long time. She handed him his cup. She told me things I should have asked about years ago. Is she? She's working on it. Victoria sat at the table. We both are. She wrapped both hands around her cup. She said she needs time. I said, take it. She looked at him. I meant it. I'm not going to push. Good. She's not going to be easy about us, not for a while. That's fair? It doesn't bother you? He sat down across from her. Of course it bothers me, but Alyssa not being fine with something doesn't mean the something is wrong. He held her gaze. She'll get there or she won't. We can't decide that for her. Victoria looked at him for a moment. You're very clear-headed about things that would make most people spiral. I have a 5-year-old, he said. Spiraling is a luxury I can't afford. She almost smiled. Fair enough. Sophie appeared from the hallway in her pajamas, rubbing one eye, having apparently decided that whatever time it was actually time to be awake. She surveyed the scene, Mason at the table, Victoria with her tea, and said to Victoria, You're here again. I am, Victoria said. Sophie considered this. Are you staying? Not tonight. I'm just having tea. Sophie looked at the 2 cups. You should stay, she said, with the particular authority of someone who has given the matter serious thought. Then she went back down the hallway to her room, which was apparently the conclusion of the business meeting. Victoria looked at Mason. Don't read too much into it, he said. She told the electrician who fixed our outlet that he should stay for dinner. I'm choosing to take it personally anyway, Victoria said. December arrived the way it always did in Nashville. Not cold enough to feel like a real winter, but cold enough to matter. The city's stringing lights along the streets downtown, and the air carrying that specific smell of approaching holiday that was partly wood smoke and partly something more intangible, some collective turning of attention toward warmth and people and the things that were supposed to matter. Mason had always liked December more than Christmas itself, the month rather than the day, the long accumulation of small seasonal pleasures. Sophie's school concert, the way she insisted on a real tree, the specific chaos of the week before break when everything felt simultaneously urgent and suspended. This December was different in a way he couldn't have predicted 6 months ago. It was fuller, the specific kind of fullness that comes not from more activity, but from the presence of someone in the ordinary days, whilst in the grocery store conversation on a Tuesday, in the text at 9 p.m. saying finish the Hartfield proposal, I think it's good, send help anyway. In the Saturday afternoon at his apartment when she helped Sophie build a model of an octopus out of pipe cleaners and foam balls with the seriousness of someone whose professional reputation depended on its structural integrity. He was building the studio proposal. He had met with Ellen Park twice. Victoria's introduction had yielded exactly what she'd predicted. A woman who asked questions that reframed his thinking and challenged assumptions he hadn't known he was making. He was writing the business plan in long sessions after Sophie was asleep, the kitchen quiet, the post-it still on the cabinet, though he'd stopped needing it as a reminder. He knew what he was building toward. The shape of it was becoming clearer with every draft. He told Victoria about Ellen Park's feedback on a Thursday dinner at her house. The two of them at her kitchen table after she'd made the roast chicken she made when she had time, which wasn't often, and she had listened the way she always listened, completely, nothing held back. And then she had said, "She's right about the fee structure. You're undervaluing the consultation phase. People pay for expertise. If your fee communicates that the consultation is preliminary rather than the product, you'll attract clients who treat it that way." "I know," he said. "I've been revising it." "Show me the draft." He took out his laptop. She moved her chair around to sit beside him and read everything, the whole document, without saying anything until she was done. And then she went back to 3 specific places and made comments in the margins of his notebook. She'd picked it up from the table without asking, and he'd found that he didn't mind. And they talked about it for another hour, and the conversation had the particular quality of 2 minds working toward the same problem from different directions and finding the places where their approaches fit together. She understood what he was building better than anyone except him. That mattered to him more than he knew how to quantify. "You're going to do this," she said at one point. Not a prediction. A statement of something she'd assessed and concluded. That obvious? No. Most people don't get there. But most people don't have this kind of clarity about why they're doing it. She looked at the notebook. You know exactly what the space is supposed to do. That's the thing most people spend 20 years trying to figure out and never do. He looked at her. You've been saying things like that to me since I was 26. You weren't ready to hear them at 26. What changed? She looked at him steadily. You got real, she said. Sophie made you real. Before that, you were talented and good and slightly abstract, like a building with beautiful bones that no one was living in yet. He didn't say anything for a moment. The kitchen was warm, the smell of the roast chicken still in the air, the December dark pressed against the windows. That's the most accurate description of who I was that anyone's ever given me, he said. I told you I occasionally say useful things. He leaned over and kissed her. Not a planned gesture, just the natural consequence of everything she'd said, and the way she'd said it and the particular quality of being seen accurately by someone who chose to stay anyway. She kissed him back and put her hand on the side of his face, and it was the same as it always was with her. Uncomplicated in its feeling, if not in its situation, and he had decided some weeks ago to let that be enough. The situation was not resolved. Alyssa had called Victoria twice since their Saturday lunch. Short calls, cautious, the fragile early calls of a relationship being rebuilt rather than maintained, which was harder and more important and would take longer than anyone wanted it to. She had not reached out to Mason, which he understood. He gave her the space she'd asked for without making it into anything larger than it was. He told his sister about the studio plan at Thanksgiving, which Claire had received with the characteristic Reed family combination of genuine enthusiasm and immediate practical skepticism. She'd asked 3 questions about financing, 2 about timeline, and then said, "You're going to be good at this," without explaining why, which was the highest compliment in the Reed lexicon. Sophie had overheard and asked what a studio was, and Mason had explained it was a place where you worked on ideas, and she had said, like a laboratory? And he'd said, kind of, but for rooms instead of science. And she'd thought about it and said, so you're making rooms that do science. And he decided that was close enough. Everything was still in motion. The studio proposal wasn't done. Alyssa was still finding her way back to her mother, which was its own long project with no guaranteed timeline. The situation he and Victoria occupied, the particular territory of 2 people who had arrived at each other from unexpected directions and were committed to the difficulty of staying, was not a finished thing. It was an ongoing one. He was learning to be comfortable with ongoing rather than resolved, which was a kind of maturity he'd come to later than he would have liked, but had come to nonetheless. He thought about this while driving to pick up Sophie on a Friday afternoon in mid-December, the radio on low, the city dressed in its seasonal lights. the year coming toward its end with the particular gravity that years always carried when you'd actually lived in them. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. He waited until the light changed, then checked it. Alyssa. He pulled to the curb, read the message. I know this isn't easy for any of us. I'm not there yet. But I'm trying. I thought you should know. He sat with it for a moment. Not relief exactly. Something quieter. The recognition of a door that wasn't open yet, but had stopped being locked. He wrote back, "Thank you. That means something." Then he pulled back into traffic and drove to get his daughter. Alyssa's text sat in Mason's phone like a small stone he kept returning to, turning over in his palm when he had a quiet moment. I'm not there yet, but I'm trying. He hadn't framed it or made it into anything larger than it was. He'd read it, responded, and let it be what it was. A beginning, not an arrival. He'd learned enough about beginnings by now to know that treating them like arrivals was the fastest way to ruin them. He showed Victoria the message the following evening. She read it twice, handed his phone back without a word, and went to stand at her kitchen window the way she did when she was feeling something she hadn't finished processing. He let her stand there. After a while, she said, "She's trying," and her voice had the quality of someone confirming something they wanted to believe. "She is," he said. Victoria turned back to the room. Her eyes were dry, but doing some work. "I don't know how long it takes," she said, "to fix something you've been not fixing for 15 years. Probably longer than feels reasonable," he said, "and shorter than it feels right now." She looked at him for a moment. Then she crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him, which she didn't do often. She wasn't a person who initiated that particular kind of contact easily, not from withholding, but from the specific caution of someone who had learned to take up only as much space as was clearly offered. He held her, one hand between her shoulder blades, and she put her forehead against his shoulder and let out a long breath that seemed to carry most of the week in it. "Okay," she said, after a moment. "Okay," he agreed. She stepped back and straightened her blazer in the automatic way she always did when she'd allowed herself something and was now returning to the regular business of being herself. He found he loved that too. The self-correction, the small adjustment back to center, the way she was simultaneously the most controlled person he'd ever known, and, in the moment she let the control rest, entirely and humanly undone. He was using that word freely now, at least to himself. Not announcing it, not turning it into an occasion, just letting it be the accurate description of an interior condition, the way you name a room by what it's for rather than what it looks like. January arrived without ceremony, the way it always did. December's warmth and light withdrawing overnight. The city returning to its ordinary self, stripped of seasonal decoration and left with just the cold and the long ordinary stretch of a year beginning. Mason liked January. He'd always been a person who found clarity in the stripped-down months when there was nothing to attend to except the work and the daily life, and the people who stayed when there was nothing festive to recommend the staying. The studio proposal went to Ellen Park on the 4th of January, a version he was genuinely proud of. Not because it was perfect, it wasn't. There were 3 things he'd have changed with another week, but because it said clearly what he was trying to build, and why and for whom. And it did so without the kind of hedged, apologetic language that proposals used when their authors weren't sure they deserved to ask for what they were asking for. He sent it at 11:15 at night after Sophie was asleep and sat with his laptop open for a moment in the quiet kitchen, the Post-it still on the cabinet, coffee stained and slightly curled at one edge. He got up and peeled it off, turned it over, wrote 3 words on the blank side. Studio, partner, forward, put it back. Ellen Park called 2 days later and said she wanted to meet. The meeting lasted 3 hours and left Mason with 4 pages of notes, a revised fee structure, a contact at a commercial real estate firm who handled studio and creative spaces, and the tentative framework of a partnership agreement that would need lawyers and time but had the basic shape of something real. Ellen was the kind of person who thought out loud and expected you to keep up, which he found he could do, and who didn't soften assessments that needed to be direct, which he found he could handle. She had built her consultancy on a philosophy that he recognized, that the work itself was the argument, that quality was not a marketing strategy but a standard, that reputation moves slower than ambition, and it didn't matter. "You need a space by spring," she said, toward the end of their meeting. Not an office, a studio. Something that communicates the philosophy before anyone's seen the portfolio. The environment is the first project. I know a commercial broker, he said, and I know what the space needs to do. Then find it, she said. That's your first deadline. He found it in February. A converted carriage house in East Nashville, 2 blocks from the original neighborhood he'd grown up admiring, 800 square feet of raw space with original brick on the north wall, and a ceiling height that most designers would have considered a problem, and he considered an argument in favor of everything he'd been building toward. He called Victoria from the parking lot immediately after walking through it. I found the space, he said. Where? East Nash, Cavalry Street. It used to be a carriage house. The bones are... He stopped, turned around and looked at the building from the outside, the winter light on the old brick, the way the afternoon came in at an angle through the high windows he could already see from where he was standing. Victoria, the bones are extraordinary. When can I see it? Now, if you're free. She was there in 25 minutes, which told him she'd already been heading that direction before she confirmed she was free. She walked through the space without saying anything for the first several minutes, which was how she handled things she was evaluating seriously. She touched the brick, looked up at the ceiling, stood in the middle of the main room, and turned around slowly, taking in the light from both directions. It's right, she said finally. I know. What's the lease structure? He told her. She made a small noise that indicated it was reasonable. Then she looked at him with the expression she had when she was about to say something she'd already decided about. I want to invest, she said. He'd been halfway expecting it and had been halfway preparing his argument against it. Victoria Saim, not as a partner, not as anything that changes the structure you're building with Ellen, as an investor with a defined return structure and no operational involvement. She held his gaze. I've seen the proposal. I've watched you work for 4 months. I'm not doing this because of what we are to each other. I'm doing it because it's a sound investment in a designer who is significantly undervalued by the market. If we ever... He stopped. Started again. If this doesn't work out, the investment stands regardless of what happens between us. Her voice was level and not unkind. I'm not confusing categories, Mason. I've been in business long enough to know that's how things go wrong. She paused. But I believe in what you're building. And I have capital that's sitting in accounts earning less than it should be, and this is a better use of it. So let me. He looked at the space around them, the light on the brick, the height of the ceiling, the way even empty and unfinished it had the quality of a room that wanted to be something specific. I'll have Ellen talk to your lawyer, he said. Good, she said. And then, because she was Victoria and the business conversation was finished and now the other one could resume. It's going to be beautiful. It's going to be a lot of work first. That's what I said, she said. Spring came. The way spring came in Nashville. Not gradually, but suddenly, the city going from gray to green in what felt like a long weekend. The trees along the streets filling out overnight. The air shifting from sharp to soft in the particular way that made everyone feel, for about 2 weeks, that things were going to be all right. Mason had lived here his whole life, and it still caught him. The studio opened in late April. Not with an event. He'd decided against an opening party, partly because he wasn't ready to perform, and partly because the studio itself was the statement he wanted to make, and a party would have put the emphasis in the wrong place. He unlocked the door on a Tuesday morning with Sophie beside him, who had asked to come because she considered it a significant occasion and had dressed accordingly in her good sneakers and her jacket with the embroidered collar that she saved for things that mattered. She walked in ahead of him and stood in the center of the space the way Victoria had, turning in a slow circle, taking in the light. It smells like wood, she said. That's the brick. And the floors, I had them resanded. It smells good. She looked up at the ceiling. It's tall. On purpose. Why? He thought about how to explain it. Because rooms with high ceilings make you feel like there's room for your thinking to spread out. Like you're not compressed. Sophie considered this with the seriousness she applied to everything. Like when I think better outside than inside. Exactly like that. She turned and looked at him. I'm proud of you, she said, very simply, with no particular drama, the way she said most true things. He crouched down to her level. Yeah? Yeah. She looked around once more. Victoria's going to like it. She's already seen it. She'll like it more now that it's done. Sophie spoke with the confidence of someone who had been paying attention. Then she pulled her backpack off her shoulder and took out her marine biology notebook, because she had apparently decided she was going to work while he worked. And she went and sat on the window bench he'd built along the north wall and opened her notebook to a new page. He stood up and looked at the studio. His studio. His daughter at the window, the light coming in at the right angle, the brick warm in the morning, the space waiting to become what he'd spent 2 years building toward. He let himself have 30 seconds of just feeling it. Then he went to his desk and started working. Alyssa came to the studio in May. It wasn't arranged. She texted on a Thursday. "Can I stop by? I want to see the space." And he wrote back, "Anytime. I'm here until 6. And she came at 4:30 in the green coat she still hadn't replaced and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the room before she came in. "It's good," she said. "It's really good. Thank you." She walked around slowly, looking at the drawings on the wall, the material samples on the work table, the books stacked on the shelves along the south wall that he'd been trying to organize for 3 weeks. She stopped at the window bench. "Sophie's?" she said, looking at the marine biology sticker on the corner of a notebook he'd propped there. "She likes to work here when school's out." Alyssa smiled, a real one, without effort. "She sounds like a personality. She has very strong feelings about cephalopods." "As you should." She looked at him. The afternoon light was coming through the high windows, and it was the kind of light that was honest about everything, and in it he could see that she looked less tired than she had in November. Something had settled in her face, not resolved exactly, but accepted. She sat on the window bench. He sat on the stool at his work table. "I've been thinking," she said. "Okay." "About all of it. What I said to you on the phone. What I said to my mother." She looked at her hands. "I was right about some of it, and I was using the true parts to avoid looking at the other parts." "What other parts?" She was quiet for a moment. "The part where I ended what we had because I could feel it wasn't working, and then resented the fact that you moved on. Those are not compatible positions." She said it without self-pity, just as a fact she'd arrived at and was now willing to say out loud. "I told myself a story where I was left. I wasn't. I left. And then I made it mean something it didn't mean." Mason said nothing. He gave it space to be said. "My mother didn't take anything from me," Alyssa continued. "She found something. That's not the same." She looked up. "I'm not saying it doesn't still feel weird. It does. But I'm not going to let the weird feeling tell me a story that isn't true." "That's..." He stopped, chose a more honest response than the one he'd started. "That took courage to get to." "It took 4 months and about $200 in therapy," she said dryly. He almost laughed. "Worth it?" "Marginally." She picked up the marine biology notebook and looked at the sticker. An octopus, hand-drawn by Sophie, with 8 arms of varying accuracy. She really likes octopuses. She'll correct you. It's octopuses or octopodes, not octopi. She feels strongly. This time Alyssa did smile, and it stayed a moment. "Mason," she said. "Yeah. I don't know what we are now, as, whatever, former people. I don't have a word for it. Neither do I. But I think it's probably okay. I think we can probably be something without it being weird." She paused. "Eventually." "Eventually works," he said. She nodded, set the notebook down, stood up and looked around the studio once more. "She's good for her," she said. "My mother. You're good for her. I've watched her for a month being, I don't know, less armored. She sent me a funny text last week about a meme. My mother sent me a meme." "Was it a good meme?" "It was a terrible meme. That was the point." She picked up her bag. She was trying. She's not always good at the small stuff, but she was trying. He walked her to the door. On the sidewalk, she stopped and turned, and she looked at him the way people look when they've decided to say the thing they might not say if they give themselves more time to think about it. "Be good to her," she said. "She doesn't let people in easily, you know that." "I know. And when she does, she..." Alyssa stopped. "Just don't make her regret it. I won't, he said, and he meant it the way he meant the things that weren't promises because they were too important for the pressure of promises. They were just facts, stated quietly, carried without drama. Alyssa nodded once, walked to her car. He stood in the studio doorway and watched her go, and the afternoon was ordinary and warm, and the trees on Cavalry Street were fully green now, and something that had been unresolved for 6 months had shifted into something he couldn't quite name but recognized as better. Victoria turned 51 in June. She told Mason 3 weeks in advance that she didn't want a party, which he already knew because she'd said the same thing about 50, and meant it, and he said he wasn't planning one, and she said good, and they said no more about it. On the morning of her birthday, he left a bag on her doorstep before she was awake. He knew her schedule, knew she was up by 6:30, made his drop at 6:15. Inside, a thermos of coffee from the cafe on 8th, the one they'd gone to in October. The oat latte she'd described as something she wasn't into but had tried twice more since. A book of architectural essays he'd found at the same used bookstore where she'd found his. And a card, which he'd spent more time on than he expected, not because he couldn't find the words, but because he kept finding too many and having to remove them until he was left with the true core of it. You told me to find the smallest door. I found it. Thank you for knowing it was there. She called at 7:02. The latte, she said. I thought you didn't like them. I've been reconsidering my position. Is that right? The book is... He heard her turning pages. Mason, where did you find this? Bound and found on Woodland. The same shelf you got mine from, actually. A pause. You remembered what shelf? I remember things, he said. It's a whole thing I do. She was quiet for a moment, and he knew the quality of this particular silence. It was the silence of someone receiving something they weren't prepared for and were managing the feeling of it privately before speaking. He'd gotten to know all her silences. This one was his favorite. Thank you, she said, and her voice was the real one, unguarded, the one she used in the kitchen after Sophie fell asleep and the city was quiet. Happy birthday, Victoria. Well, they went back to Peleus that evening. Not as a planned symmetry, or rather, it was exactly a planned symmetry, but he'd proposed it simply, without ceremony. I want to take you somewhere for your birthday, the place where we started. And she'd said all right, which was how she said yes to things she wanted that she hadn't expected to want. The restaurant was the same, the exposed brick, the pendant lights, the jazz quartet in the corner that had shifted personnel but kept the same approach. Carlo's place would never be this, but this had its own history now. Carlo's was where he thought. Peleus was where it had started. They were seated at a different table, not the one by the east window, but from where they were sitting he could see it. The table where she had sat with the bread basket and the untouched wine and the assembled smile, counting minutes, convincing herself the humiliation was manageable. The chair across from it was occupied tonight by a man who was leaning forward, talking with some urgency, and the woman across from him was laughing, and it was a different story entirely. Victoria had seen him looking. Different view from over here, she said. Better view, he said. She was wearing the navy blazer, the same one from the night they'd met. He recognized it and suspected she'd chosen it intentionally, the way she chose most things. The gold at her ears, the off-center pin. Her hair had more gray than it had had last October, or maybe he was just seeing it more clearly now. He had stopped noticing the age difference in any practical sense weeks ago. He had started noticing it only as the thing that had given her the particular kind of depth that younger women he'd known had not yet had occasion to develop. Not because they weren't capable of it, but because depth of that kind requires weight, requires the accumulated experience of carrying things over time, and there was simply no shortcut to it. She was, he thought, exactly the person she'd needed to become to be who she was now. So was he, for that matter. That they'd arrived in the same place from directions that didn't quite make sense on paper seemed, at this distance, beside the point. What are you thinking? She said. That you look exactly the same as you did that night. I look 51. You looked 51 that night too. He picked up his menu. I meant the composure, the assembled thing you do. She tilted her head. Is that a compliment? It's an observation. He looked up. The difference is that I know now what's underneath it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked down at her menu, and he could see her not quite smiling, and he let that be what it was. They ordered. They talked about the studio. He'd signed a second client this week, a boutique hotel renovation that was the kind of project he'd designed the studio to attract, complex and high visibility, and requiring the exact philosophy he'd built his proposal around. He told her about the first meeting with the client, a woman named Joanna Park, who'd walked in with a 12-page brief and expectations that were precise to the point of being almost architectural themselves, and how the conversation had gone from brief review to a 2-hour discussion of what it meant for a hotel to feel like it had a personality rather than a concept. "That's the work," Victoria said. "That conversation is the work." "I know, I didn't always." "You always knew. You just didn't have the context to do it at scale." She poured water from the carafe. "What else?" He told her about Sophie's end-of-year school showcase, where Sophie had presented a 3-minute oral report on octopus cognition to an auditorium full of parents who had been clearly expecting a kindergarten performance involving construction paper and had instead received something that required them to take notes. Sophie had stood at the front of the auditorium with her composition book under her arm and spoken from memory, and then fielded questions with the patience of someone who had considered these topics at length and was prepared for the gap between her knowledge and her audience's. Victoria listened with the expression she always had when he talked about Sophie, focused, soft, something close to what he could only describe as love, though she would have said that was an overstatement and he would have quietly disagreed. "She asked about you this morning," he said. "She wanted to know if you were coming to the showcase." But Victoria had not known about the showcase. He had told Sophie it was a school event, that it was mostly for parents, that Victoria was busy. Sophie had apparently decided to form her own opinion about this. "I would have come," Victoria said. "I know, next time. Tell her I want to read the full report. She'll recite it to you from memory. Prepare accordingly." Victoria smiled, and it was the unguarded one, and the jazz quartet in the corner shifted into something slow, and the dinner moved through its final hour with the ease of an evening between two people who have stopped needing to fill space and have started being comfortable in it. After dessert, shared, which was new, she'd started letting him order things to share, though she'd initially claimed she didn't do that. He paid the check over her routine protest, which she made every time and then abandoned after approximately 15 seconds of resistance. "You don't always have to do that," she said. "I know. I make significantly more money than you." Also true. He signed the receipt. "And yet," she looked at him, "you're very stubborn." "I prefer determined." "You would." But she wasn't not smiling. They walked out into the June evening, the city warm now, the kind of Nashville summer night that hadn't yet become oppressive, still carrying the last of the spring softness before July arrived and removed all ambiguity. The street below Peleus was lit and moving, people on the sidewalks, the distant sound of music from somewhere down toward Broadway. She stopped on the sidewalk outside the restaurant entrance and looked up at the sky, which in the city was never quite dark, always carrying the amber glow of a million lit windows. He stood beside her. "1 year ago," he said, "roughly, you were sitting at that table waiting for someone." "I was sitting at that table deciding to stop waiting for someone," she corrected, "and I walked over." "You walked over," she agreed, "which I told myself was just a coincidence of location." "Was it?" She considered this the way she considered everything, genuinely, without rushing to the answer she wanted to give. "No," she said. "I don't think it was. I think you've been walking toward me for longer than either of us had the language for at the time." He looked at her. The city was behind her, and the light was doing the thing it did here, warm and amber and slightly imprecise, and she was exactly who she'd always been, composed and complicated and capable of things most people he knew weren't. And she was looking at him with the expression that had no management in it, the one she'd started showing him more often in the months since January, the one that said, "I'm here, and I chose this, and I'm not calculating the cost of it." "Victoria," he said. "Don't say something careful," she said, which was what she always said. "I love you," he said, which was the thing he'd been carrying since December and had been waiting for the right occasion for, and had finally decided that the right occasion was whatever occasion was in front of him, because there was no perfect one, and he'd learned that waiting for perfect was the same as not going. She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "That's not—" "I love you too," she said. "I've loved you since approximately October, and have been managing it like a business problem ever since." He laughed. She looked at him with the half-affronted expression she used when she hadn't intended to be funny. "It's an honest characterization," she said. "I know, that's why it's funny." She put her hand in his, which was something she'd gotten better at in the months since winter. The small public gestures, the willingness to be seen in the ordinary ways. He held it, and they stood there for a moment on the sidewalk outside the restaurant where it had started. And the city moved around them the way cities do, indifferent and continuous. And it was not a perfect moment in the way stories sometimes manufacture perfect moments. It was a real one, which meant it also contained everything else. The ongoing work of the studio, Alyssa still finding her footing, Sophie somewhere across town with a babysitter, and her marine biology notebook, the year ahead with its unknowable shape. All of that was present. It didn't diminish the moment. It was, in fact, the moment. "Are you happy?" he said. She turned to look at him. The question was the same one he'd asked her in October over the small Italian restaurant's candlelight, and she recognized it by the slight change in her expression. "Yes," she said, not hedged, not qualified. "I am." "Good," he said. "Me too." They walked to her car together. He drove home after, through the June streets, the windows down, the city going about its business around him. Sophie was asleep when he arrived, Gerald under one arm, the marine biology notebook on the nightstand because she'd apparently been reading it before bed, a habit she'd started 2 months ago that he found endlessly right about her. He stood in her doorway for a moment the way he did most nights, not checking anything, not confirming anything, just acknowledging. This life, the one he'd built from the available materials, imperfectly and with considerable trial and error, the life that had arrived at this particular shape. He thought about something Victoria had said once, back in the winter when they'd been talking about what it meant to deserve something. Love, success, happiness, the full catalog of things people wanted and weren't sure they were allowed to want. She'd said, "I used to think deserving was something you established, like credentials. Like if you did enough of the right things, you'd earn the right to the good ones." He'd asked her what she thought now. She'd been quiet for a moment, and then she'd said, "I think you just have to keep showing up, that's it. Not because you've earned it, just because you chose it and you keep choosing it." He thought about that now, in Sophie's doorway, in the quiet of his apartment, in the life he'd kept choosing even when it was hard and unglamorous, and nothing like what he'd imagined at 22 or 26 or even 30. He thought about the post-it on the cabinet, its evolution from 2 words to 3. He thought about the studio, the window bench, Sophie working there in her good sneakers while he worked at the drafting table. He thought about Victoria at Peleus the first night, folding her composure around her like a coat, checking the door. He thought about Alyssa on the sidewalk outside the studio. Just don't make her regret it. He would not. He knew that about himself. Not because he was better than anyone else at this kind of thing. He had made mistakes in plenty of other contexts and would make more. But because he understood now, with the particular clarity that came from paying attention over time, that love was not a condition you arrived at. It was a practice. A set of daily decisions, most of them small, many of them invisible, all of them cumulative. You showed up. You chose the person on the days when choosing was easy and on the days when it cost something. You let yourself be seen in the ordinary moments, and you made space for the other person to be seen in theirs. You didn't wait for the right occasion. You made the occasion out of whatever was in front of you. That was the whole of it. Not a revelation, just a fact, the way the best true things were usually just facts, stripped of drama once you'd finally looked at them directly. He closed Sophie's door softly and went to the kitchen and stood at the cabinet for a moment, looking at the post-it. Studio, partner. Forward. Coffee stained at the corner, the writing a little faded now, the tape losing its hold. He peeled it off carefully, folded it once, and put it in the drawer where he kept things worth keeping. Then he turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, and the city went on outside the window, warm and lit and continuous, and somewhere across Nashville, Victoria Langford was reading the book of architectural essays, or she was answering the last email of the day, Or she was already asleep with her reading glasses on the nightstand and her shoes slightly off center by the door. Either way, she was there, and tomorrow she would still be there, and the day after. He fell asleep quickly, which was a thing that had taken him a long time to be able to do. There was a particular kind of rest that came from having chosen your life and meaning it. He'd found it at 32, standing in a restaurant, walking toward a woman at a table for two. He had not known then what he was walking toward. He knew now. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was everything.